afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies and distinguished guests. I have the pleasure to speak to you about Fiji. Basically, I'm Fiji's Consul General based in Sydney and also Fiji's Trade Commissioner to Australia and New Zealand. When Robert and I first met in March earlier this year, and he had this vision for putting together a Pacific Islands investment seminar, we were fully behind it, and the government of Fiji was fully supportive, particularly because of the special relationship that Fiji and Papua New Guinea share when it comes to our economy, as well as our people, as part of the Melanesian Spearhead Group. So basically, ladies and gentlemen, that background picture is basically a photograph from one of the latest resorts that has launched in Fiji, called the Marriott Momi Bay. It's quite a beautiful resort. I just returned from Fiji yesterday, and when I look at the picture, I have very fond memories of home and wish I was there. So in terms of today's presentation, I'll basically talk about the key policies and the business climate we have back home in Fiji, the foreign direct investment trends, particularly when it comes to the Australian economy, and some interesting investment opportunities in a few key sectors. Now, when it comes to key policies and incentives, I understand Papua New Guinea has launched its very own trade policy framework a month or so ago. Fiji launched its first trade policy framework back in 2015. So we've had an interesting few years in terms of implementation. But what we can share is that this is a very critical document when it comes to promoting trade and investment. Through this document, we have a number of institutional bodies that are set up in Fiji, and these bodies are basically a conduit for the private sector to raise their concerns with the government and basically find solutions to these problems in the spirit of partnership and goodwill. We also have a number of key tax incentives or incentives for investors who come and invest in Fiji. But in a lot of the research that the Fijian government has done when it comes to talking to existing investors on the ground and prospective investors overseas, tax incentives, while being a key element, is not the be-all and end-all. A lot of issues that concern investors, particularly in the area of utilities, the cost of utilities, access to land, access to a well-qualified labor force, and as well as technology. And so these are the other areas that the Fijian government has been focusing on. But when it comes to taxation, we have one of the lowest tax rates in Fiji at about 20% in terms of corporate tax rates. We have a very high literacy rate at about 93%. We're connected to the Southern Cross cable network, so we have fiber optic right around the country. In fact, we will be launching fiber optic services to the second major island called Vanuatu in December this year. So the whole of Fiji will basically, or majority of the population will be connected to high-speed internet. We have also a party to a number of trade agreements, as you know. We have the Melanesian Spearhead Trade Agreement, which involves Fiji, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and also we have trade agreements with the European Union, with the Interim Economic Partnership Agreement, and obviously Spartica. Now, when it comes to the health of the Fijian economy, the performance of the Fijian economy has been quite phenomenal over the last 7 years. In fact, we're on track to record our 8th consecutive year of economic growth later this year, projected at about 3.6%. We have had through this period a number of natural disasters, as you know. We've had about 4 cyclones in the last 10 years, the worst of which was last year with the tropical cyclone Winston, which claimed about close to 50 lives and cost the economy about $1 billion. But despite that devastation, we were still able to achieve about 2% economic growth, which is testament actually to the resilience of the Fijian people, plus the institutions that we have. In terms of the sectoral contributions to the 3.8% economic growth, it's quite broad-based, which is a good thing for an economy, particularly small island states, which are quite vulnerable to natural disasters. So a lot of the growth has come from our financial services sector, from transportation, from wholesale and retail, and tourism, which is the mainstay of our economy. But we have a lot of potential for other sectors, such as information communications technology, education, healthcare. Now, in terms of government expenditure, the Fijian economy has grown, as I mentioned, quite phenomenally. It's not showing here, but back in 2004, 2006, government expenditure was about $1.3 billion. In the last 10 to 12 years or so, it's grown from 1.3 billion to 4.3 billion, which is quite phenomenal. And from 2006 to 2016, we've increased taxation revenues from 1 billion Fijian dollars to about 3 billion Fijian dollars. That's despite the fact that we've lowered tax rates to about 20%. Now, in terms of the major expenditure areas for the $4.3 billion that I showed you earlier, a lot of this is being spent on education. This is basically this year's national budget allocations. So our education budget has gone from $300 million to about close to $1 billion this year. Roads budget has remained steady for the last four years or so at about $528 million. Healthcare budget has increased, and also investment in water and energy. There's a huge policy objective for government when it comes to infrastructure, which is why you see a lot of money being spent in this particular area. So without key infrastructure, as you know, investment cannot take place and private sector development cannot happen. So when it comes to foreign direct investment, particularly by Australian investors, a lot of these investments are targeted towards the services sector, including tourism as well. So if you look at the graph, roughly about 60% or so of investments that come from Australia are towards the tourism industry and other services-based industries. One thing that the Trade Commission is trying to do is diversify this into other areas as well. As I mentioned to you, broad-based growth is one of the key things that we're looking at. So we had about 269 projects over the last 3 to 4 years, which total about $1.3 billion from Australia. In terms of the process for investing in Fiji, it's quite streamlined. We have an organization in Fiji called Investment Fiji, which is very similar to the Investment Promotion Authority in Papua New Guinea and also other investment agencies in the Pacific. What we've done over the last 3 to 4 years is move everything online. So you can basically register your investment online. You can follow up online in terms of the different approvals process. And it's quite streamlined. And within the 5-day period, you can basically have your investment registered. Some of the key issues that we have been facing, and this is covered by the Doing Business report as well, is the second-tier approvals process, which is an issue that a lot of the other countries face. We are working through those issues, particularly in terms of approval for building permits, for example, issues with getting electricity and others. While we've improved quite a bit, we understand we have some work to do in this area, but rest assured the government is prioritizing this. Now, when it comes to investment opportunities, I just wanted to reassure you, we don't treat Australian investors like that. It's only your rugby players. So tourism sector, obviously, is one of the very key areas that we're aggressively promoting. As I mentioned to you, the Marriott Mommy Bay launched earlier this year with about 150 to 200 rooms. We have another project in Mommy Bay called the Sofitel, which is a 7-star resort. We've also got a Wyndham, which is a $500 million project opening up in the Coral Coast in the next few years. We've got a new Pullman resort, a Holiday Inn. So there's a lot of hotel infrastructure that is being built in the country. And one of the key reasons for that is the huge number of tourism arrivals coming in. So last year, we almost hit 800,000. We were at about 792,000 tourist arrivals, which is a record for our country. And this year, we'll definitely surpass that. It's just that it probably will be well over 800,000 this year. In the month of July alone this year, we hit about 90,000 arrivals, which is a record. So a lot of tourists are coming in, obviously, from Australia and New Zealand, which makes up about 60% of the arrivals in Fiji. And just as the previous speaker was mentioning, we have our eye on China. So that statistic where you have about 49,000 Chinese tourists coming is last year. Back in 2013, that was about 4,000. So it's grown by 10 times in about 3 years, and it's going to grow even further. We have a number of charter flights into Shanghai at the moment. We fly directly to Hong Kong about 5 times a week. We're flying to Singapore now about 3 times a week, and to Korea about 3 times a week. So these are the main points in which Chinese tourists are coming through to Fiji, and we see a lot of growth in this area. At the moment, Fiji has about 400 hotels, offering about 11,000 rooms, 24,000 beds. The majority of it is in the main island of Viti Levu. But if we were to maintain this current growth rates at a straight line level, the demand for hotel rooms or beds would increase by about 4,000 by the year 2025, which is quite phenomenal. When it comes to investments, as I was mentioning earlier, in tourism, the vast number of hotel projects come in from Australia, but particularly because of the strong relationship when it comes to our people. When it comes to tourists coming from Australia, they understand the Fijian economy, they understand the Fijian people, and the way we do business, which is the key reason why we get a lot of Australians investing in Fiji when it comes to tourism. 42 projects were registered in that period from 2013 to 2016. valued at about $490 million. And as of February 2017, 30 projects are in the development stages, ranging from $3 million to $500 million in value. One of the other projects that I failed to mention was the Kokomo Island Resort that began operations in March this year. That's a $300 million project that was started by Mr. Lang Walker of the Walker Corporation. And so that's also about a 6 or 7 star resort in Kandavu. The other key sector that the Fijian government is targeting is ICT and business process outsourcing. This is a sector that has grown exponentially over the last 10 to 12 years. We really started to hone in on this sector back in 2004 when we brought in ANZ, its back office operations in Fiji. ANZ at the moment has about 400 people working in Fiji, servicing the Asia-Pacific market, and they're looking to grow that. We also have a company called Mindpearl, which has about 1,300 people working there, servicing 14 clients around the world, including Libara Mobile in Australia, DHL. They have the contract for Malaysian Airlines in terms of their English speaking. And they also have, it's a multilingual call center basically, where they speak Dutch, French, and also Spanish. So these are the capabilities that we're trying to build in Fiji. We've got another company that came on board a few months back called Recovery Scope from Melbourne that has about 400 people working there. It's a debt recovery business. When we asked the managing director for the company on what compelled them to choose Fiji as their investment destination, some of the reasons that they stated are on the screen. It's basically our people in terms of our work culture. We have the Bula spirit, which is well renowned when it comes to the tourism sector. Also, they call it a neutral accent when it comes to the English-speaking abilities of Fijians, and also the higher literacy rate. He also shared a very funny example by basically saying that debt recovery is quite a sensitive conversation, if any of you have had that. It's basically following up on overdue bills, payments, or mortgage payments. And so when it comes to the study groups that they had, testing the Fijian clients and also call center agents, some of the interesting things they found was that when a Fijian basically places a call to an Australian following up on an overdue bill, it starts out as breaking the ice in a very unfriendly conversation. But when they know it's a Fijian on the line, they start talking about their last holiday to Fiji. And what a great time that they had, and basically wish that they could go again. So basically that's the angle that some of these things are happening, and we're taking advantage of it. We also have very good legislation. There's also favorable time zone advantages as well. We cater to a lot of clients in Europe, Brussels Airlines, for example, Swiss Airlines. The agriculture sector is also a sector that is taking off quite well in Fiji. We have about 500,000 hectares of suitable agricultural land. We're getting a lot of projects coming in from Asia, particularly Chinese investors in agriculture. One thing that works for us is that we've got very good bilateral quarantine arrangements with the New Zealand market. About 30 agricultural commodities are able to be shipped to New Zealand under the BQA. It's not so good with Australia. We've got about 3 or 4 products and something that we're working on. But through those market access arrangements, Fiji has been able to increase its agricultural output and exports to New Zealand and Australia in particular. We've also got dairy production in Fiji. We basically produce about 11 to 18 million liters annually, but our total domestic demand is about 80 million liters. So there's a lot of potential for investment in the dairy sector in Fiji. We've also got chilled beef imports. But I think one statistic that I'd like to probably emphasize in terms of market size is if you look at the Fijian population, we're only about 870,000. But if you add the number of tourists, though, that come to Fiji annually, you're looking at a market of about 1.7 million people when it comes to food and beverage, transportation, and basically providing essential goods and services to them. So it's quite a big market in the Pacific. We've also got huge potential for niche agricultural produce. One initiative that we're launching very shortly is Fijian Organic. So Fiji is basically naturally organic. We don't use a lot of chemicals when it comes to agriculture. It's all done naturally. So it's basically a key niche agricultural produce or export that we're trying to basically promote. Tax exemptions, as mentioned earlier, is also available for investors in this sector. Now, manufacturing is quite an interesting sector for us, particularly being a small island economy. We don't benefit from economies of scale. So one thing we've done is try and focus on niche products. So you probably are all aware of our very famous product called Fiji Water. So that's done very well. I've had the benefit of visiting the Fiji water factory, and it's quite remarkable, the things that they managed to achieve over the last 20 to 25 years. They export about 400 containers a month. If you look at our export data with the United States, it's about $100 million annually, and 99% of that is Fiji water going to the North American market. So it's a huge export for us. Key areas that you should be looking out for as investors is our forestry sector. We have the largest plantation mahogany in the world, with about 54,000 hectares of mahogany in Fiji, and about 90% to 95% is unharvested at the moment. So we're looking for investors to come in and sustainably harvest mahogany as well as other forestry products. We also have very exciting opportunities in the fisheries sector, benefiting from the natural benefits we have in terms of infrastructure and support services that we can provide. We also have a very established TCF sector, textiles, clothing, and footwear. So if you are aware of the Kukai designer label in Australia, which is about 30 outlets in most of the shopping malls in Australia, they manufacture most of their materials in Fiji. Right? So they employ about 1,300 people in Fiji. So it's quite a huge employer as well. We also supply suits to David Jones from Fiji, and we also have a lot of other high-end manufacturing that is done in Fiji when it comes to niche exports. One thing surprising you may not know of is that the NRL jerseys that the teams in Australia wear are also manufactured in Fiji. The AFL jerseys are also manufactured in Fiji. So we do quite well in terms of the small orders, and that's what we've managed to develop a niche around. Renewable energy, I think this is a sector that we are all focusing on. Fiji is the incoming president of the COP23 negotiations that will be held in Bonn, Germany later this year. So our Prime Minister and our leaders have made it a point that we as a country take a lead when it comes to renewable energy and reducing greenhouse emissions. So we have our green growth framework. Currently, 60% of the energy produced in Fiji is through renewable sources. The Prime Minister has made it a target that by 2030, we'll try and go 100% renewable. So building new dams, hydro dams, looking at solar energy through solar panels, and wind energy as well, so alternative sources of energy. We've just completed construction on a 12-megawatt biomass plant in Fiji that cost about 100 million, so that's also supplementing electricity in Fiji. So there's opportunities for independent power producers to come into Fiji and work with government in this area. So just to quickly summarize, as I mentioned, our Fijian economy has accelerated to about 8 years of consecutive economic growth. We've got favorable growth prospects. In fact, Moody's just released its latest ratings on Fiji, and we've been upgraded to BA3 as of yesterday. FDI is basically growing year on year. We've got very prudent fiscal management when it comes to our debt levels and government spending. A lot of the expenditure when it comes to the government budget is spent on infrastructure. So about 60% of our budget goes towards infrastructure. We've got broad-based growth. We've got foreign reserves that are an all-time high at about 2.3 billion, which is able to cover about 8 months of imports. We've also got inflation that's quite stable at about 3%, and as I mentioned to you, the credit rating.